Harney County, Oregon, a high desert, sagebrush, wind, and dust that gets into everything you own. A University of Oregon field school had been digging at a rock shelter called Rimrock Draw for years. Slow work. Screens, trowels, buckets. The kind of excavation where you spend a whole season moving dirt and finding almost nothing worth photographing. Then they hit a scraper. Orange agate, roughly the size of a palm, worked along one edge into a working surface. The kind of tool you use to strip a hide or clean meat off bone, on its own, unremarkable. Tools like that turn up across the American West by the thousands. The problem was where it was sitting. Above it, sealed across the deposit, was a layer of volcanic ash traced to Mount St. Helens, not the 1980 eruption. An eruption from the deep Pleistocene, laid down somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,800 years ago. Understand what that means physically, because this is the whole story in one sentence. Ash falls once. It falls from the sky, it settles, it gets buried, and it does not reverse. Anything underneath it was there first. That is not an interpretation. That is gravity and geology, doing the only two things they know how to do. So the tool was older than the ash, which made the tool older than the moment humans were supposed to have existed anywhere in the Americas. The accepted number was 13,000 years. That was the wall. One migration from Siberia down a corridor between two ice sheets, arriving right around 13,000 years ago and spreading fast. Everything in North American archaeology was built on top of that number. Textbooks, museum timelines, dissertation committees, grant panels, careers, and here was a scraper sitting under an ash layer that fell nearly 3,000 years before the first people were supposed to have taken a single step onto the continent. Patrick O'Grady, the archaeologist running the excavation, has spent a long stretch of his professional life at that rock shelter. Slow, careful, unglamorous work. Somebody made that tool. Somebody shaped the edge, used it, and set it down in the dirt of what is now eastern Oregon. The hand is gone. The tool stayed, and the crew standing over it knew exactly what the position of that scraper meant before a single lab result came back. They also knew what was about to happen when they said it out loud, because they had seen it happen to other people. The first thing they did was test the edge. Residue analysis came back with protein consistent with bison on the working surface. Not decoration, not ceremony, not a chunk of pretty rock somebody carried around. This was a butchery tool. Somebody killed or scavenged a large animal and used this piece of agate to take it apart. That already puts you in a scene. Blood, hide, cold air, an animal that no longer exists in that landscape. Then came the dates. Fragments of bison tooth enamel recovered from the associated deposits were sent for radiocarbon dating. The results announced in 2023 came back around 18,250 years. Say that number slowly, 18,250, against a model that said 13,000. That is not a rounding error. That is not a slightly early date that you fold into the existing framework with a footnote. That is roughly 5,000 extra years of human presence with nowhere to go, 5,000 years of people living, hunting, moving, and dying on a continent the textbook said was empty. The stratigraphic logic is embarrassingly simple, and that is exactly what makes it dangerous. The layer above was younger, the layer below was older. The tool sat sealed between them under a sheet of volcanic ash that had come down from the sky and covered everything. It could not simply have fallen there later. Now, here's the part that makes this different from the fringe material you have seen 100 times before. This is not one eccentric with a metal detector and a website. This is a university field school, published work, presented at conferences, defended in front of colleagues who did not want to hear it. The dating was done in commercial and academic labs using standard methods. The ash was identified by geochemical fingerprint, the way volcanic ash is always identified. Nothing exotic, nothing invented. Everything about the process was conventional. The only thing that was unconventional was the answer. And that is where a discovery stops being a scientific finding and becomes a political problem inside a discipline. Because a date does not just sit there. A date says something about everyone who published a different number, The tool was real. Nobody disputes the tool. The meaning was the fight. Now let me be fair, because if I'm not fair here, the rest of this falls apart. The criticisms of Rimrock Draw are not stupid. They are the standard toolkit, and the standard toolkit exists for good reason. Rodents burrow. A ground squirrel digs a hole, an object falls down through 100 generations of tunnels, and suddenly a young artifact is sitting in an old layer looking like a revolution. Roots push through sediment and drag things with them. Frost heave moves objects vertically. Water moves everything. And there is a sharper objection than any of those. The dated material is bison enamel. The artifact is a scraper. Proving that a tool and an animal tooth found in the same general deposit represent the same moment in time is genuinely hard. Association is the oldest argument in this field, and it has killed more sites than bad dating ever did. Every one of those objections has correctly buried a bad site before. They should be raised. They have to be raised. But here is the thing I want you to sit with. Those exact objections, in almost the same wording, have been deployed against every single site in North America that came in older than the accepted wall, for 80 years. Same script: rodents, roots, disturbance, contamination, association unproven. At some point, a universal explanation stops functioning as an explanation and starts functioning as a reflex. Because notice what the reflex does. It never has to prove anything. It only has to raise the possibility of a problem, and the burden immediately swings back onto the excavator, who now has to demonstrate a negative in a deposit that's been sitting in the ground for 18,000 years. That is not skepticism. That is a rigged scoreboard. And there is a second layer to it, one that is not about the dirt at all. To accept Oregon, you first have to accept that the model Oregon violates was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong by thousands of years. And wrong in a way that means decades of confident teaching, publishing, and museum labeling was built on a floor that was never there. That is not a data problem. That's an institutional problem. And institutions do not have to conspire to protect themselves. They just have to keep doing what feels responsible. So here is the uncomfortable truth about Rimrock Draw. Its real significance is not that it is shocking. It is that it is not. That scraper under the ash is not a lone anomaly screaming into an empty room. It is the newest name on a very long list of sites that the field spent decades explaining away, one at a time, until the list got too long to keep explaining. To understand why that list exists, you have to understand where the wall came from. Blackwater Draw, New Mexico. The 1930s. Excavators there found distinctive fluted stone points lying stratigraphically beneath the already known Folsom points in direct association with mammoth remains. Clean layers, clear sequence, repeatable. They named the older type Clovis after the nearby town. And here's what almost nobody tells you when they mock the Clovis first model. It was a triumph, a real one. The 19th and early 20th centuries had been an absolute swamp of early man claims in the Americas. Fabricated finds, misread geology, fossils from one layer paired with tools from another by people who wanted a headline. The field had been humiliated repeatedly. Blackwater Draw was the first thing that held up. It was solid, it was replicable, and it gave American archaeology a chronological anchor after a century of embarrassment. Rigor was earned, it was not arrogance, it was scar tissue. But scar tissue hardens. Over the following decades, the Clovis point stopped being a type of artifact and quietly became a boundary marker in time. The oldest thing, the first thing. And once a discipline agrees on a first thing, everything older is not a discovery. It is an error waiting to be identified. Nobody had to organize this. That is the part people get wrong when they reach for the word conspiracy. There was no committee, no memo, no sealed archive. There was peer review, staffed by people whose life's work assumed the wall was real. There were grant panels making funding decisions about which projects looked serious. There were dissertation committees deciding which young researchers were promising and which ones were reckless. None of those people had to act in bad faith. They only had to be normal, cautious professionals defending standards they genuinely believed in. And that is more effective than any cover-up, because it never looks like one. You do not need to destroy a discovery, you only need to make the person defending it look irresponsible. Ask James Adovasio, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, southwestern Pennsylvania. Adovasio and his team excavated one of the most meticulously documented stratigraphic sequences in North American archaeology, and out of the deepest cultural levels came radiocarbon dates running back around 16,000 years. That was 3,000 years past the wall. The response was not a shrug. The response was decades of sustained attack, focused on one argument: there is coal in that region, ancient carbon could have leached into the samples, and the dates are therefore inflated. It is a legitimate chemical concern. It deserved investigation. It got investigation. Adovasio and colleagues addressed it, tested for it, published on it, and kept publishing on it for most of his career. Think about what that actually costs a human being. Not a scandal, not a firing, something slower and more corrosive. You spend your professional life re-answering the same objection at the same conferences to the same rooms, while your one great site sits in the literature with an asterisk on it that never quite comes off. Then there was Tom Dillahay, Monte Verde, southern Chile, a settlement preserved in a waterlogged peat bog, which is a gift because peat preserves organic material that normally rots away to nothing. Wooden structures, plant remains, hearths, and dates around 14,500 years. Chile. Look at a map and feel the problem. If the first Americans entered through Alaska at 13,000 years, how does a village exist at the wrong end of two continents, 1,500 years before those people were supposed to have arrived? The field dismissed it for over a decade. Then in 1997, a group of prominent skeptics traveled to the site to examine it in person. Among them was C. Vance Haynes Jr., the most rigorous and most feared critic of early site claims in the discipline. They looked, and they conceded. Now, I want to be careful here because it would be easy and cheap to turn Haynes into a villain. He was not. He was a serious scientist applying serious standards, and those standards protected the field from a lot of garbage. But when one person's standards become the gate that everything must pass through, delay stops being caution and starts being doctrine. Adovasio and Dillahay were not arguing for a date. They were arguing against the shape of a discipline. The concession eventually came. The apology never did, and the decades those two men spent absorbing the damage were not refunded to them. Now go north, because the doorway itself is real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Swan Point in the Tanana Valley of interior Alaska. The deepest cultural layer, Cultural Zone 4, dates to roughly 14,150 years. It is the oldest, firmly accepted human occupation in Alaska, and essentially nobody in the field fights about it. What makes Swan Point important is not just the age, it is what came out of the ground. Microblades, tiny, razor-thin slivers of stone, struck from prepared cores with a technique that takes real skill to learn and real skill to teach. You do not stumble into microblade production, you inherit it. These slivers were designed to be slotted into grooves, cut along bone or antler shafts, glued in a row, creating a composite cutting edge. Break one, replace one. It is modular tooling engineered by people carrying an established tradition, and that tradition is not local. It is the same technological signature found in late Pleistocene Siberia in what archaeologists call the Duktai complex. So the Siberian connection is not in doubt. It is stone-cold documented. The doorway was real, people came through it, and the toolkit they carried can be traced across the Bering land bridge like a signature on a receipt. Here is where it stops being comfortable. If the earliest firm evidence in Alaska is around 14,150 years, how do you have someone scraping a bison hide in Oregon at 18,250? And how do you have a village in Chile at 14,500? Essentially the same moment as the Alaskan site, on the far side of two continents and 10,000 kilometers of ice, mountain, river, and forest. You cannot walk that fast. Nobody walks that fast. The genetics offered a way out, and the way out was called the Beringian standstill. The idea is that a population moved out of Siberia and then sat, isolated in the Bering land bridge region, cut off from Asia behind them and ice in front of them for thousands of years, genetically drifting, becoming distinct, It is elegant, it is well supported, and people talk about it as though it rescued the old model. It did not rescue anything. It was the old model quietly conceding that human beings were already out there in the north waiting thousands of years before Clovis existed. The wall did not hold. It just got moved somewhere less embarrassing. Then a child's grave in interior Alaska took the whole argument out of the theoretical. Upward Sun River. Archaeologists excavating a residential site found a burial pit beneath an old hearth containing the remains of infants, laid down with red ochre and grave goods around 11,500 years ago. This is not a data point, this is a funeral. People in a brutal climate stopped what they were doing, dug into the ground of their own living space, and buried children with ochre and offerings. That is grief, preserved in sediment. In 2018, researchers published the genome of one of those infants, and the result did not fit anybody's neat diagram. She belonged to a population that split away from the ancestors of other Native Americans roughly 20,000 years ago. Then that population stayed separate, and then it ended. Researchers named the group the Ancient Beringians. Read that again, because the implication is brutal. She is not an ancestor of living Native Americans. She is a cousin from a branch of the family tree that terminated, a whole population of people with a whole history we will never recover who existed and then did not. Now hold that number up against everything else. 20,000 years ago, according to DNA extracted from a real child in a real grave, the founding population was already splitting into separate branches. That split does not happen in a vacuum. It happens because human beings were already in the north, already isolated, already dividing into groups, which means the genetics had killed the single-wave story before the archaeology was willing to admit it. The DNA said the branching had begun by 20,000 years ago. Oregon said someone was butchering bison at 18,250. And for the first time, those two numbers stopped fighting each other and started agreeing. Then, in 2023, the source itself got complicated. A team publishing in Cell reports traced a specific maternal lineage, mitochondrial haplogroup D4H, including the D4H3A branch that shows up along the Pacific coast of the Americas, and followed it backward. It did not lead to interior Siberia. It pointed toward northern coastal China. The study proposed 2 radiation events out of that region. One during the depths of the last glacial maximum when the world was at its coldest, one later in the terminal Pleistocene, and a related branch of the same lineage turns up in Japan. Now, the caveat, delivered honestly, and then I am going to tell you why the caveat does not diffuse it. This is one maternal lineage. It is not an entire ancestry. The mainstream position remains that the ancestral Native American population formed in Northeast Asia and Siberia, and this study does not overturn that. Fine. But look at the direction of travel it implies. Coastal, maritime, following a shoreline, not grinding through a frozen interior corridor. The source was not a single point. The route was not a single line. The story was never one wave of one people walking one path. And the map printed in every textbook for 50 years had exactly one arrow on it. Which brings us to the claim that most archaeologists want nothing to do with. San Diego, 1992, a highway expansion project, heavy machinery cutting through old sediments, a paleontologist named Richard Cerruti monitoring the work, spotted bone in the exposed face, mastodon. What came out of that deposit was strange. Limb bones broken in spiral fracture patterns, the kind that happen when bone is fresh rather than fossilized. Heavy cobbles sitting among the fragments, interpreted by the excavators as hammerstones and anvils, with damage patterns consistent with impact. Bone fragments that appeared to refit, as if something had been struck and shattered in place. The site sat in storage for decades. Then the dating technology improved. In 2017, a team including Stephen Holen and Thomas Demir published in Nature. Uranium-thorium dating on the bone returned an age of roughly 130,000 years. Let me be completely direct with you. Most archaeologists reject this. Not politely, comprehensively. The objections are serious. Construction equipment can shatter bone and produce fracture patterns that mimic percussion, and there are no stone tools at the site in the accepted sense. No flakes, no worked edges, nothing unambiguously manufactured. There are no human or hominin remains, and the date sits an entire order of magnitude beyond any secure evidence for people anywhere in the Americas. That is a mountain of reasonable doubt, and I'm not going to pretend it away. But 2 things stay true. The excavators documented that deposit carefully, in place, before the machinery reached it. And in the years since, the site has not actually been explained away. It has been outvoted. If this interpretation were correct, It would not bend the accepted story of human origins in the Americas. It would snap it in half, which is precisely why the pushback was total. This is not the answer. Do not walk away thinking it is the answer. It is the edge. Proof that once the timeline started sliding, nobody could confidently say where the floor was anymore. And then the route itself fell apart. The ice-free corridor. Every textbook map had it. That narrow green channel opening between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets as they pulled apart. A hallway through the ice from Beringia into the heart of the continent. It was the mechanism. The entire model depended on it. In 2016, researchers took sediment cores from lakes along the corridor route and analyzed them for ancient DNA, pollen, and radiocarbon. They were not looking for people. They were looking for something more basic: food. Because a corridor of bare, scoured rock and meltwater is not a migration route. It is 1,500 kilometers of starvation. You need plants. You need grazing animals. You need a functioning ecosystem before you can walk a family through it. The answer came back around 12,600 years ago. That is when the corridor became biologically viable. Read that carefully, because it is one of the great quiet reversals in modern archaeology. The corridor opened too late to have delivered the people who were already living south of it. Monteverde is older. Meadowcroft is older. Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, excavated by Lauren Davis, is older. Oregon is far older. The hallway was not the way in. Back in 1979, an archaeologist named Knut Fladmark argued for a Pacific coastal route instead. Boats, shorelines, marine resources. The field largely sidelined it as speculative. Decades later, John Erlandson and colleagues put a name and a mechanism to it. The Kelp Highway. A near-continuous belt of kelp forest running from Japan up around the North Pacific Rim and down the Americas, packed with fish, shellfish, seals, and sea otters. One ecosystem, one skill set, no ice to cross. So why is there so little evidence for it? Because the Pleistocene shoreline those people walked is now under more than 100 meters of water. The evidence is not missing, it is drowned. For decades, the absence of early coastal sites was treated as proof there was no coastal migration. It was proof of sea level, and once you allow boats into the picture, a lot of things you assumed about ancient people stop being safe. Go back to Monteverde for a second because it supports this directly. That site sits inland, but among its remains are seaweeds and marine species, some of them medicinal. Those people were connected to the Pacific. They knew the coast. They used it. Then there's a site nobody in American archaeology likes bringing up because it is on the other side of the world and it undercuts the same assumption. Crete. Researchers surveying the Plakias region on the island's southern coast reported quartz hand axes and other early stone tools, and argued on geological grounds for ages far beyond anything conventionally accepted for seafaring. Here is what makes Crete different from an ordinary early site. Crete has been an island for millions of years. There is no land bridge. There has never been a land bridge. Whoever left those tools crossed open water to get there. Now, the honest framing. The Plakias' dating remains debated, and the age estimates rest on geological and geomorphological arguments, rather than direct dating of the artifacts. Take it as an argument, not a verdict. But the pattern behind it is not debatable, and that is the point. Over and over, in region after region, evidence for water crossings turns up earlier than expected. And over it gets resisted. Because the idea that primitive people could not sail was never a finding. It was an assumption, dressed up as caution, and it was doing enormous quiet work inside the old model. Somebody loaded a boat. Somebody pushed off from a beach they could still see and pointed toward a horizon they could not. Strip out the ice-free corridor. Add watercraft. Add a coastline full of food that is now underwater. And a scraper in Oregon at 18,000 years stops being impossible. It starts looking late. Which brings us to the man the field spent 40 years being wrong about. Bluefish Caves, northern Yukon. 3 small caves in the Keel Range. Jacques Cinq-Mars excavated there from 1977 to 1987 and reported something that could not be allowed to be true. Mammal bones bearing cut marks in deposits dating far beyond the wall. What happened to him was not refutation, nothing so clean. It was erosion, sustained skepticism, questions that never resolved because they were never designed to resolve, support that thinned, a site that gradually stopped being discussed as a data set and started being invoked as a cautionary tale, the example you point to when explaining to graduate students what happens if you get ahead of the evidence. He carried that for the rest of his career. Then, in 2017, a new generation took the collection back out of storage. Lauriane Bourgeon, Ariane Burke, and Thomas Hyam examined the bone assemblage under high magnification, systematically separating the marks that carnivore teeth make from the marks that a stone tool makes when someone is cutting flesh away from bone. Then they redated the specimens. The human-modified bone was confirmed. The oldest came in around 24,000 years. He was right. And notice what that vindication does to the rest of the story. 24,000 years in the Yukon is exactly what the Beringian standstill genetics predicted. The DNA said people were up there, isolated before 20,000 years ago. Cinq-mars had physical evidence of it in hand in the 70s, and the field treated it as a problem to be managed. Here is what I want you to understand about this, and it is the emotional core of the whole thing. The cruel part was not that people questioned him. They had to question him. That is the job, and it is a good job. The cruel part was how efficiently the man became the problem instead of the data. The vindication arrived 40 years after the trowel went into the ground. There is no ceremony, no reckoning, no public accounting for the decades. Well, the field simply moved on as though it had never been otherwise. And then the argument stopped being about molecules and layers and turned into something anyone can look at and understand. White Sands, New Mexico, the Tularosa Basin. What is now a gypsum desert was once the shoreline of an ancient lake, and in the soft mud along that shore people walked. Footprints, hundreds of them, sealed under gypsum, preserved in the exact shape of the moment they were made. In 2021, researchers dated seeds of an aquatic plant, Ruppia, found in the layers directly above and below the tracks. 21,000 to 23,000 years. The counterattack was immediate, and it was reasonable. Aquatic plants can take up dissolved carbon from old groundwater, which can make radiocarbon dates come out artificially old. It's called the hard water reservoir effect, and it is a real problem. So they tested it again. In 2023, the team came back with independent confirmation. Radiocarbon on terrestrial conifer pollen from plants that took their carbon out of the air, not the water, and optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains, a method that measures when sediment was last exposed to sunlight and does not involve carbon at all. Same window. They tested it with one method, same answer. They tested it with a completely different physics, same answer. That was the problem. And look at what the tracks actually show. One sequence records a person carrying a small child, setting them down, picking them up again, walking on. Mammoth and giant ground sloth tracks cross the same surface. That is not a specimen. That's an afternoon. The footprint outlasted the person who made it by 23,000 years. Now go back to Oregon and look at that scraper again. 18,250 years under volcanic ash in the high desert. A few years ago, that number was an outlier to be explained away. Today, it sits quietly between Bluefish caves at 24,000 and White Sands at 23,000, and it looks almost ordinary. That is what changed. Not one site. The neighborhood. So what happened to the old model? There was no press conference, no retraction, no accounting for 80 years of dismissals or for the people who absorbed them. Museum labels got softer. Textbook sentences picked up the words "at least" and "may have." Papers started writing "long assumed" where they used to write "established." Migration maps grew a second arrow, drawn along the coast, usually in a lighter color. The wall did not fall. It was renovated overnight, and everyone showed up in the morning acting like it had always looked that way. And the real question is not settled. It is wide open. If people were standing on that lake shore 23,000 years ago, where is everything else they made? The hearths, the camps, the tools, the graves, the ordinary debris of thousands of years of human life. Some of it is under 100 meters of Pacific water, on a shoreline that drowned when the ice melted. Some of it is in a museum drawer right now, cataloged wrong, waiting for someone to open it. And some of it is still in the ground in Oregon, under a gray band of ash that came down out of the sky, settled and kept an honest record of what was underneath it. The ash never had an opinion. The people reading it did.